Well, welcome to Ravensdale Bible Academy. Today's course is Fake News from our Think Again series. And today's specific lesson is, what is fraud? So we're talking about fake news. Now we've introduced this concept of fraud. And so fraud has a very specific definition as opposed to fake news, which just kind of has a floating idea or concept. Again, we come to this understanding with the presupposition of, the Bible telling us, look, study to show thyself approved. 2 Timothy 2:15 calls us to really, get after it, right? Don't be ashamed of the way you've studied one of these issues or a news article. Be ashamed if you don't. Be ashamed if you just listen to a 10 or 15-second blurb. Then you have something to be ashamed of. But you are called to study. And so we want to study this idea of what fake is. We want to understand the difference between fake and fraud. And so fraud is actually a legal definition. It's a definition that can lead you into courts, a definition that can lead you into jail or prison. And so, Black's Law Dictionary describes it in this way: a knowing misrepresentation of the truth or concealment of material facts to induce another to act to his or her detriment. So it's purposely misrepresenting or concealing key statements, key facts, key evidences in order to harm another person. So that's what fraud is. So the question then is, do we see fraud? Do we see out and out fraud in the news? And that such cases, not only is it fake, but it's actually fraudulent. And so give you an example, we hear a lot about education. We talk about education all the time. We hear how, scores are down. We hear how the inner city doesn't have enough money. We hear, about how, the way to solve education is by pouring, more money into an area, raising taxes, that kind of a thing. Well, is it true? Well, if we applied this idea of fraud to how they report on schools, we would look at it this way. Education needs more funding, but they fail to tell us, exactly what is that money going towards, right? And they fail to tell us that they've already raised taxes, and they fail to tell us that they're going to keep raising taxes. What they do then is they divert your attention, right? First they mislead you, then they divert you and tell you it's all about the children. It's all about the children. They're not paying the children anything. How is this extra money really helping the children when they keep increasing the administrators' salaries that they don't teach children? They keep building new buildings which don't teach children. And so it's not really about the children. They don't focus on the misuse of their funds. And then finally, they keep saying that, big conclusions, little evidence. More money will solve the problem, will show me the evidence of that. There is no evidence of it. And so that would be kind of a quick little example of how a news article can be swayed to leaning a certain way when really all it's doing is perpetuating fraud. The report is a fraudulent report. I want to give you an example. Good buddy of mine, Barry Minko, this is him when he was 17 years old, had a $240 million carpet cleaning business, and it was a fraudulent business. And Barry spent 8 years in prison, and when he got out, we did fraud seminars together. We did a fraud radio show. We wrote a fraud book, how to help people not, get caught in scams, frauds and scams. And so Barry had defined fraud in three different ways, using really Black's Law Dictionary, but kind of synthesizing it into, common terms for the common man to use. And so the way he defined it was in these three different ways: diversion, big conclusions with little evidence, and then failure to disclose key material facts. And so I I want to break that down. What does diversion look like? So we see, here's the president of the United States, and this is Joe Biden. And just before he became the president, he's talking against the current president. And you can see here on the bottom, it says, Biden is basically calling Trump an embarrassment to the country while he's calling for unity. So this is a diversion tactic, right? So he calls for unity, right? And so that makes people think, oh, he's a good guy. He's calling for unity. Meanwhile, that's a diversion for what he's really doing, which is impeaching Trump. So that's how diversion works. Divert your attention. We're impeaching Donald Trump to, hey, let's all unite. Well, we're not going to unite when half the country is divided. That's fraudulent. Another example is kind of this idea of big conclusions with little evidence. The president talking about, the idea of COVID and more deaths. And he says, well, the darkest days are still ahead. Well, how does he know that? He doesn't know that. He has no evidence to support that. These are just these big, grand statements with no evidence that then the news perpetuates that report, which is why it's fake news. There's no proof of that. One of the key elements that they use all the time is this idea of failure to disclose key facts. So we keep hearing about this organization called Black Lives Matter. Well, do Black Lives matter? Of course Black Lives matter. All lives matter. Human lives matter. We definitely don't want a specific race, whether it's Black or Korean or Mexican, Italian, whatever the race is. We would never want to focus and isolate, by race. That's racism. And attack a certain group. And so if you have an organization called Black Lives Matter, well, yeah, of course it matters. Of course you should care about it. Of course you should donate money, right? Except that that's not what their organization's about. And so what they do is on one side, they present themselves as a Black Lives Matter, but on the other side, they're doing other things. They have different beliefs. They believe in socialism, and they have different agendas behind their organization. They're failing to tell people the key facts about who they actually really are. They're failing to tell people about where the money that you send them actually really goes. Does it go towards helping Black lives, or go towards buying them houses for millions and millions of dollars? Important to identify and know that. Another example of failure to disclose key material facts, especially in news, is when they report the news. The reporting of this news was, in writing, 51-year-old man stabs 12-year-old boy. Okay, that's what was reported. The fact that they failed to disclose was, while yelling, white devil, right? So the news doesn't show a picture of the African American person who was the one responsible for stabbing the 12-year-old white boy. There's no mention of race. There's no mention of racism. If this were flipped around, if it was a white 51-year-old man stabbing a 12-year-old black young boy, you would see the emphasis on race, but you don't see it when it's the other way around. That's a failure to disclose key material facts, and that stirs the pot and continues this tension of racism that's driven really by the news media. Another example of this idea of failing to disclose key material facts is, there was a police shooting, and the first reports that were released were essentially a police officer shooting what looks like an unarmed person. When they re-release the rest of the video, then you see the whole story changes, and instead of the police officer being a villain, really the police officer was a hero in saving two other people, black people's lives. And so we need the full story. We need the full scope in order to have the truth. And so that goes beyond just the news faking. That makes the news complicit in committing fraud. And so it's a sad thing in our society today that our news media does knowingly commit fraud. How do we know it's fraud? Big conclusions, little evidence, diversion, and failure to disclose key material facts.